Corner, there was until quite recently New Era School. In Parel, there's a mill called India United. In the Fort area, there's New India Assurance Company. And many of these establishments were set up in the years around independence and embodied the expectations that good times lay ahead, Achhe Din were coming. Over the past 6 years, those expectations and some of that vocabulary of hope have made a reappearance, this time on PowerPoint presentations and in WhatsApp forwards. Narendra Modi came to power in 2014 promising to build nothing less than a new India and to fulfill some of those promises within 100 days. Even though that didn't quite happen, at the end of 5 years, he's retained credibility with India's voters, and they've decided to give him another 5 years in which to take a shot at this. What the BJP did manage to achieve in those first 5 years, though, is the subject of Professor Jayal's extensive, incisive volume, Reforming India, featuring essays by a host of experts, a veritable who's who of Indian academia and journalism. The volume is divided into two sections. The first is about Modi one's initiatives in the fields of politics and governance. And the second is about the mark it has left on politics and society. The word mark, though, probably isn't strong enough to refer to the effects of the project that Modi has embarked upon. As Professor Jayal has noted, the aim wasn't just to reform India, to make changes, to remove flaws in the way we function. Instead, the ambition has been full-scale reformation. And this, as she writes, is a bolder project whose aim was to construct anew, to mold, fashion, and shape India in a way that radically departed from the form of nation building attempted in the decades since independence. Reform, as she noticed, signals continuity with an improvement, to make an improvement in the present. Reformation, on the other hand, implies a radical break and is anchored in a fundamental revisioning of India in social, cultural, and even moral terms. So, Professor, could you give us a sense of what your book is about, and we'll take it from there. As long as you want, until Vivek and his people raise those boards.
So this is the book. As you can see, it's a doorstopper, about 700 pages long. So I'm obviously not going to talk about the entire book because there are contributions by over 30 people in this book, as Naresh has already sort of mentioned to you that it's a lot of academics, journalists, and practitioners who've contributed to the book. But what I'll try and do is give you a flavor of my argument, which is in an extensive introduction, and then perhaps we can take it forward from there. But I want to start by saying a few words about the context of this book. I mean, why this book, right? It was published in April this year, which was about 3 months later than the originally anticipated date of publication. It was meant to be published well before, or a few months before, the 2019 general election, right? There were lots of other books. In fact, it strikes me that this is a quite extraordinary election in, of course, many ways. Among them, that there was a spate of books being published just before the 2019 elections. Many of them were about elections per se, so whether it was Prannoy Roy, Naveen Chawla, and Mr. Qureshi and others. And then there were several books on the RSS, and subsequently that has continued. We have books on the sort of doctrinal aspects of the RSS and so on coming out. And you had one serious work on the academic work on the majoritarian state. You had a few others on, at least one other on in report card mode. This book is somewhat different from all of those. But to return for a second to the question on why this flood of books just before an election, which I think is uncommon, I think it has something to do with the fact that the credibility of the mainstream media had become somewhat suspect in the last few years. That's part of what was going on between 2014 and 2019. I mean, obviously, I exclude what Naresh edits, that is scroll. I exclude publications, if you call them that, digital publications like The Wire and so on. But in general, the mainstream media, including the electronic and especially the electronic media, had become quite suspect. And there has been also a genuinely greater public engagement with issues of politics and public policy, with social media providing a forum for quite a lot of this. So, or rather, however, while more and more people seem to be genuinely interested in politics than before, sadly, there's less and less scope for reasoned debate and reasoned disagreement. And that is part of the gap that this book was trying to fill, which is, it's an intervention, a kind of contribution to the larger cause of informed debate and disagreement. And I emphasize the word informed, because debate and disagreement we have aplenty, but informed debate is much harder to come by. And that is what we presume citizens in a democracy to be doing. However, the forms of greater public engagement that we've seen on social media, and this came up in the plenary, in the opening plenary session in which Naresh was also a panelist, finds reflection in what Ravish Kumar has called WhatsApp University, deeply divisive, polarizing opinion, even on issues on which facts can speak for themselves. But the whole idea of fact has become such an unstable idea in itself, with alternative facts, with fake news and all of this, that it's hard to arbitrate. So that again was something that this volume was trying to plug. It was commissioned, all these articles are, I think one was published before, but every other article here is specially commissioned by people who have subject expertise, but who were asked to write for a general audience, to write accessible pieces, even if they were academics, asked to write accessible pieces for the general public. And it's ambitious in coverage, but it's not comprehensive. Even at this length, it's not comprehensive. And I hope it does not convey the feel of being in an echo chamber. And it's less a catalogue of facts, though facts are important, but it's more interpretive kind of essays. And I have to say this, there was no perspective or point of view that was recommended to the contributors. They were invited to comment on a specified area of their expertise in this accessible way, but interpreting them from their own perspective. So there are articles in this that, for instance, I may not agree with, substantially. So, but let me give you a sense of the diversity of contributors before I discuss what I'm arguing here. I think we have a reasonable diversity of contributors, at least a third of whom are younger scholars, because I felt that younger scholars are better placed to, or younger practitioners are better placed to think about the present in the context of the past and the future, to have a more balanced view than someone my generation might. And so let me tell you who some of the chapter authors and topics are. Yogendra Yadav writes on farmers' insecurity, Smita Gupta of The Hindu on the PMO, Ramchandra Guha on Kashmir, Ravish Kumar on the media, Pratiksha Bakshi on governing India's daughters, which is an essay on Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, Madhav Khosla on judicial accountability, Anant Eltumre, whom you heard last night, on onslaughts on Dalits in the time of Hindutva, young lawyer Gautam Bhatia on freedom of speech, Ram Manohar Reddy on demonetization, Diane Coffey on Swachh Bharat, and Yamini Iyer on welfare. So you see, it's a fairly wide range. Anyway, in a sense, Naresh has done part of my job by explaining what this idea of reforming India, it's a slightly clumsy title, but the hyphen is important. In the first iteration of the program here, the hyphen was actually forgotten, because most people do not realize that the hyphen is so significant to the title, which it is. What it signals is that what we've been living through since 2014 is an experiment in reforming India, as opposed to just reforming it. So, like Naresh just said, you could have economic reform, you could have administrative reform, and that was, in a sense, what was promised to us, which simply is about improving what seems to be not quite satisfactory. But reform is a bolder project that seeks to remake and reshape and remold and so on in a way that departs radically from the vision of the Indian nation that was advanced in the course, that was forged and advanced in the course of the movement for freedom from colonial rule, and which found embodiment in the Constitution. I'm not 100% on the same page as Anant Teltumre's argument last night that the entire constitution is more or less bogus. I don't believe that. I think that, you know, 3/4 of it, yes, we know is borrowed from the Government of India Act of 1935, but the remaining 1/4 is a profoundly significant and important document, one that I am happy to live by, even if the powers that be often are not. Anyway, so in 2014, what we were promised or what we were offered, and there was a little bit of, you might say, subterfuge here. There was an offering of Vikas, development, and what was not explicitly offered, or at least not by the prime ministerial candidate at any rate, was the project of Hindutva. Other leaders were espousing that project quite openly. So the same day that Narendra Modi spoke in the Sri Ram College of Commerce in Delhi University about Vikas and development, the same day Rajnath Singh in Allahabad at the Kumbh Mela, I think, spoke on Hindutva and how when the BJP came to power, it would advance the project of Hindutva. But there were many people who had a touching faith that it would be economic and administrative reform, and through that, Vikas, that would take precedence over Hindutva, which you might take as a synonym for reform. It turned out that reform has been way more successful than reform, with, in my view, unhappy consequences for our social fabric. So from Make in India, we've actually got to Project Remake India, right? When this book was published, as I said, in April, we were already being reformed. But since May, I think the evidence that we are hurtling rapidly, even unstoppably, towards being reformed, the evidence is now overwhelming. Right now, at this moment, possibly on Monday or Tuesday, there's going to be the introduction of a new citizenship amendment bill in Parliament. And a two-tiered citizenship is being created with alacrity in any case. The Citizenship Amendment Bill will, through that, we will see the introduction of a differentiated citizenship, a two-tiered citizenship based on religion. And this strikes at the basic root, at the roots of what you might call our basic structure of equal citizenship. The bill, for those of you who don't know it, is basically a bill that seeks to provide fast-track citizenship for illegal migrants and refugees from 3 neighboring countries, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, for people belonging to all religions except one, no prizes for guessing, except Muslims. And the latest version of the bill has not actually been circulated. I've seen some screenshots late last night, which suggests that the previous version that was passed in January in the Lok Sabha said 6 years fast-track citizenship. This version says 5 years. And this version does not seem to refer to religious persecution, because the point of the bill was that it is for minorities in these 3 countries, religious minorities. It, of course, did not include Rohingyas, did not include Ahmadiyas and other sort of sects which are persecuted in those countries. Those were not included anyhow. On top of that, the evidence, there is no evidence required that you are a victim of religious persecution and thereby a refugee of religious discrimination. One hopes that there will be judicial recourse for this outrageous amendment, because think about it. It's an ordinary amendment to an ordinary law passed in 1955, which has the effect of undoing a whole constitutional structure. So there should be a legal challenge, and there will be a legal challenge to it, but I don't know how sanguine we can be about the outcome of that. What it does is, in the sense that I said, undermining the foundations of the Indian Constitution, is to create gradations of citizenship. Some will be first-class citizens, others will be second-class citizens, and it will basically legitimize second-class citizenship based on exclusively religious identity. The New India that you mentioned, and you're right, the term New India has been used even in the immediate post-independence period. It doesn't strike us so often, so that's a really valuable insight. Has come with a new nationalism, right? That's something we've all experienced. And I argue in this introduction that the political imaginary of nationalism that we inherited, let's say, from the freedom struggle, has been transformed, perhaps irreversibly. That conception of nationalism was of a civic nationalism, a nationalism that could bring citizens together, transcending or irrespective of their ethnic, religious, linguistic, regional, tribal, otherwise caste identities, leaving those identities behind, but interacting as citizens in the public sphere. That was the founding ideal of Indian nationhood at the time of independence, and it's something that's there in the Constitution. The nation as a political community is a civic community. It's not a religious community or any other kind of community. It's not a cultural community. But now the new nationalism that we have is a form of hyper-nationalism which is majoritarian, which is religion-based, which is exclusionary. And this, I argue, is a transformational, foundational shift. It redefines or asks us to redefine who we are. Our self-definition as a people, as a nation, has come into question. You might have noticed on November the 26th, which is now being celebrated ever more enthusiastically as Constitution Day. We've had a constitution for, well, since 1950, but we've never been so enthusiastic about celebrating it. I think its celebration is in inverse proportion to its importance in our lives. But one of the things that ministers of the Union government were instructed to do was to go out and read the fundamental duties section of the Fundamental Rights Chapter, Chapter 3, out in their constituencies and wherever else. This government is more invested in duties than rights. Active citizenship. Active citizenship takes what form? Give up your LPG subsidy, and then you get a certificate from the Prime Minister. Yeah? Lose your savings in demonetization, what a good citizen you are. You get a pat on the back. You see yourself as a kind of civic equivalent of the soldier on the border. The implications for welfare, however, are more serious than these symbolic and trivial things. The implications for welfare are help yourself, don't expect the state to come to your help. Now, one of the things that one of the, not slogans, but one of the phrases that the Prime Minister gave us last year was at Davos at the World Economic Forum. He said, India is committed to reform, perform, and transform. In his Independence Day speech the same year, 2018, he said that we had actually achieved reform, perform, and transform. Now, as far as reform is concerned, there are many doubters, and many of them are in this volume as well, who have actually assessed that reform process and seen what it adds up to. As far as performance is concerned, it's no longer about the performance of government. It's about governance as performance. Governance as spectacle, as theater, intended to mesmerize, intended to hypnotize even, right? So you have the leader who is an actor interfacing with citizens who constitute his audience. And this is a familiar phrase in political theory, audience democracy. Audience democracy is typically seen as a disfiguration of democracy. Not only is governance an act of performance, even violence has become a spectacle. The kind of violence we saw and the retribution for it that we saw yesterday morning, I actually didn't watch it myself, but I've been hearing about it and reading about it. Violence has for the last several years been appearing as a spectacle. People who commit violence are taking videos of it. Remember the fellow in Rajasthan who was killed, who was lynched to death. Violence also appears as spectacle. It is filmed, it is sent around on social media, it is vicariously consumed, especially when it relates to vulnerable groups in our society. And of course, there's discursive violence, which is the violence of our speech. Coarse, bullying, intimidating, and always carrying the threat of actual physical violence. So, we are becoming a barbaric society in which violence is no longer something that is pathological. In a civilized society, violence is a pathology. In our society today, which I think is fast becoming barbaric, it is not pathological, it is normalized, it is justified, it is legitimized. Like we saw yesterday, the public response to the killing by the police of the 4 rapists in the Telangana case was not just brutal, it was a form of vigilantism only being exercised by the law enforcing agencies. When law enforcing agencies begin to adopt vigilantism as their mode of action, it is time for us to sit up and actually worry as to what kind of a republic this is. Now, it is not my claim, while I say this transformation is fundamental, it is not my claim that India was a perfectly functioning multicultural democracy before 2014. I wouldn't claim that. Democracy was a work in progress still. Pluralism was something we were still fully to realize, given the substantive inequalities marking the conditions of Dalits, Adivasis, and Muslims, particularly these three groups in our society. But at least it was an aspiration. At least it was the normative framework of our society and our polity, which unfortunately now I'm not so certain of. A couple of more quick points. Civil liberties, civil society. Now seen as unnecessary because they undermine national unity by encouraging the asking of unnecessary questions. A hard-won Right to Information Act has been whittled down, first institutionally by not filling up vacancies and so on, undermined. And now we are told that the government is so transparent, why do we even need a Right to Information Act? Right? This is an official statement from the Home Minister recently, who also said that human rights need to be redefined in accordance with Indian tradition. If there is an Indian tradition of human rights, I would like to hear more about it. If any of you know about it, I'd like to hear about it. Anyway, along with this, of course, we've seen centralization of governance. We've seen the slogan of minimum government, maximum governance coming true in a kind of perverse kind of way, where you have minimal involvement of most of government in the actual tasks of governance. And at the same time, you have maximum governance through the intrusion of the surveillance state in the lives of citizens, always looking over our shoulders. I should be doing that, actually. The institutions of governance, there's an article on the PMO, fine article on the PMO in this volume, but also the subservience of supposedly autonomous institutions, whether it's the judiciary, whether it's the election commission, and so on. So I think what I've tried to argue in this introduction is that we have made a shift from, and I think it's a fundamental transformational shift about the kind of people we are, the kind of nation we are becoming, and that is a move from one kind of political imaginary of nationalism to a completely different one. Earlier, and one final point here, earlier the reformist project in the last few years was being pursued less visibly, at least less visibly by government, and more by fraternal organizations of the Sangh Parivar and by vigilante groups. Post the 2019 election, I think it is fair to say that the reformist project is directly sponsored by the state and is being pursued relentlessly, even through legislation, whether it's the alacrity with which the Triple Talaq legislation was passed, or the reading down of Article 370, and now the CAB and the NRC, all intended to change the terms of citizenship in India. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that wonderful overview of all of this. I just wanted to, I know you touched upon it in your introduction, but the spectacle we saw yesterday on our TVs of people showering petals on the police officers in Telangana, what does that tell you about the way citizens have now come to view the criminal justice system, but more broadly, the way we view our institutions and the expectations we have of them?
So it is true, of course, that the criminal justice system has been a scandal for the last many decades. There's no getting away from that, and I wouldn't underemphasize that scandal in any way. Nevertheless, I think what we're seeing now is exactly what I referred to just now as violence being no longer a pathology, something unusual, but something that is routine, that is acclaimed. If people, so it's a form of vigilantism. Even those who support that violence, who showered rose petals, are actually people who would, at a pinch perhaps, themselves go out and participate in such acts of violence which have got routinized and normalized in ways that are actually alarming for a society both for its social cohesion as well as, of course, for the rule of law, which is practically now acquiring mythological status.
In many of these sort of dramatic announcements that have been made about demonetization, about Kashmir, there is immediate widespread approval for this. How is this consent being manufactured?
I mean, I think we have a very effective and an extremely intelligent propaganda machine at work. This is not the first time that this kind of consent has been manufactured. I mean, I suppose we are all aware that there's been a resurgence now and reprinting of many novels, for instance, from the interwar years in Europe. I was reading one just a couple of days ago. It's called A Dressy Unknown. It's about the fracturing of a friendship between a Jewish man and his non-Jewish Christian colleague who moves back to Germany just in 1933-34, and it's an epistolary novel, so there's exchange of letters. And if you read the lines on liberalism in those two exchanges, in the exchanges of those in those letters, you could be talking about today. If I was to just remove those sentences, unfortunately I don't have the book with me. If I was to read out those sentences to you, you would say. So I think these are propaganda machines. The arguments haven't changed very much. The arguments haven't changed very much over time. The liberal project is, I mean, now in India, of course, liberalism is practically a bad word. So bad a word that you want to, having annexed the word Lutyens to it for some reason, to destroy liberalism, you have to destroy the buildings of Lutyens Delhi. It's that kind of project. So I think it's an effective propaganda machine, and there's a willing public, which is, I guess, what is the word? Charismatic leadership plays a role in this as well. The charisma of the leader can make even unpalatable messages, or messages that people might otherwise question, might make them more acceptable. Presumably there's also some level of trust deficit in what went before, which makes people to accept such messages. Yeah? But you're a media person, so you might have something else to say about this.
I'm looking for answers because I can't, I really don't know why my colleagues in the media have sort of so wholeheartedly thrown themselves behind this project. It's been an inversion of our traditional role, which was to be the watchdog, and we have become the lapdogs.
Incentives for people in media, for people in my line of work, for instance, I think there are incentives. But what are the incentives for ordinary people who just vote once in 5 years? What are the incentives for them? There aren't any material incentives for them, and yet. Yeah. Right? I think it's, in my more extreme moments, I think this is a form of very sophisticated hypnosis.
I mean, I've been wondering why, for instance, all these years after, in the immediate aftermath of demonetization, where everybody was put through great inconvenience, but all these years later, when we know now through data the problems that demonetization has caused, you still find so many people who will justify and rationalize it. It's sort of, we still don't have explanations for that. Well, they've told us that we have 10 minutes. I'm going to throw it open to the audience in a minute. But I wanted you to briefly talk about the other chapter you've written in the book, which is about how this is playing out in education and in the universities.
So yes, I do have a chapter on higher education. It's called Fear and Desire, Crippling the Public University. It's about how the government approach towards public universities has been characterized by both of these sort of, one might say, contradictory sentiments. You fear the public university because of the questions it asks, but you also desire to control it and to pack it in your own way. You want to control it, you want to bring it down, and at the same time you desire to be in world rankings. So there are lots of contradictory impulses at work. But this essay, I would say, is now a little outdated in the sense that the challenges thrown up by public universities in the last couple of months, including my own university, but other universities in Delhi and outside Delhi, have actually brought the issue of privatization squarely to the forefront. Funding for higher education is declining. Public funding for public institutions in higher education is declining, and students are being asked to pay and to bear the cost of whatever form of higher education that they are getting. In a country like this where you have approximately, we don't have very new data because the government doesn't believe in data, but we had an enrollment, I think in 2014 or so, we had an enrollment of 30 million people in higher education institutions in the public sector. Even at that time, according to NSO data, there were 40 million who were outside, who should have been in it. I think we have such a large population of younger people, and I'm hearing less of the demographic dividend argument nowadays, but still, many of our leaders actually talk about youth as a resource, talk about the strength of this nation with a younging population. What are you going to do with this younging population if you put education beyond their reach? The 40 million who were not in higher education a few years ago are people who could not afford to get into higher education and stay there. If you're going to remove, JNU has 40% students who might have to quit if this fee hike goes through. In that case, you will have even more and more people who are unable to access higher education, and you have a large young population. What do you propose to do with them? I think there has to be some thinking, and I fear there is no thinking. Whatever thinking there is patchy, fragmented, incoherent. There is no policy. Universities like Delhi University has already done it. I think JNU is about to do it. Taking out loans on this thing called HIFA, Higher Education Funding Authority, taking loans to see themselves through. But these loans will have to be repaid. Who's going to pay them? They're linked to the market, ultimately. So it's like an NBFC, this HIFA thing. So I think there has been very little policy thinking, serious policy thinking. The thinking about higher education has been purely ideological so far, in terms of Hindutva and so on, and that kind of agenda. It's now ideologically driven in a different sense, which is in terms of marketization and privatization, and I think both of these need to be questioned, or else we might as well say goodbye to the publicly funded higher education sector.
All right, let's take questions now. Put your hand up.
Actually, I wasn't going to ask something, but just something you said just right now struck me as you talk about how higher education now is ideologically driven, and you talked about Hindutva and so on. So what is this ideology? If just a few seconds before that you also said that the policy is piecemeal and patchwork and so on. So what kind of ideology is it that's driving this? If it is this patchwork, where's the uniform? Even if it is Hindutva, what is it taking us to?
I think what I was trying to say is that there is no serious policy which takes the higher education into account, public, private, regulation, all of those things. Instead, what we have is this ideologically driven agenda of trying to pack institutions with people who are basically receiving political awards in the form of appointments. Yes, it is, because there's plenty now written about this. If you were to sit on selection committees in my university, you would see, you would get a sort of a very of what kind of appointments are being made and for what kinds of reasons. So it's not to say that political appointments were never made before. They were, and they were common. But this is another level.
Can we combine the two questions and we'll have an answer, okay?
Good morning, ma'am. So we know that India is right now in a developing state, whether it is in terms of political, economical, social or cultural. But in some areas also we do feel that India has not yet been reformed. Like in Article 377, it has been decriminalized and all. So my question is that India is still at the running of reformation, in the sense that is India still in that process of reforming itself to be the most developed country or not?
We'll combine the two questions, please.
So I think one of the reasons for the success of the reform agenda is that it's the only game in town. There's no ideological contestation. And it's striking, if you go back 50 years to the 1967 elections, you had two communist parties, you had socialist parties of various types, you had a free market liberal party, you had a Hindu nationalist party, all of which had produced ideological literature. So, I guess why is the Republic no longer a site of ideological contestation, and why is there no one to speak up for the original form? Why is the reform agenda so uncontested?
Thank you.
Thank you. The young lady here, I think I was trying to draw a distinction between reform in the sense in which you're talking about it, and I don't think that that agenda has been accomplished or is even being attempted to be accomplished. The reform agenda, on the other hand, has been far more successful. Which takes me to Keshava's question, which is that why has it been uncontested? I mean, this is a deep question. We know that there is maybe not a critical mass, but certainly there are a large number of people who do still hold on to that idea. And that idea is an indispensable idea for the functioning of this society. We will become utterly dysfunctional if we continue on the path that we are going. What you're really saying is that there is no political organization which is advancing this problem, because political parties have, on the whole, decided that the votes lie elsewhere, and why they're not this the alternative ideological project forward.
So, ma'am, you mentioned about the public university. So, about how they are all searching for higher education and all. What about the private universities also? What do they have in what do they have in common with the public universities?
Overregulation.
Thank you very much.
series is called, as Vivek was saying, Literary Lives, and it's hard to think of anyone for whom that appellation in the plural applies more appropriately than to Rakshanda Jalil. She's been a critic, editor, translator, literary historian, biographer, anthologist. Sorry, I should say translator from Urdu and Hindi of poetry and of prose. Columnist about architectural heritage, teacher, and writer of short fiction. And that's not counting the ones that I've forgotten to mention, as well as the ones that are still to come, because obviously you've got who knows how many literary lives you're yet to lead. So I wanted to start by just going back to the beginning, though, because all these literary lives obviously start with when you fall in love with literature or reading. So you've in the past you've written of how you grew up in a Muslim home that was also very secular, nationalist. You've described your parents as Nehruvian idealists. So what was that home atmosphere like, and what were how did reading and literature start for you?
Well, I grew up in a home surrounded with books, and my mother was a librarian. I happened to be the librarian in our own school, so I saw a lot of her in school and at home, which wasn't a bad thing, really. My mother encouraged eclectic reading, so at any given time, it was perfectly, both as a librarian and as a mother, I must say. She was even-handed with all the kids that she met in school. She felt that the idea was to read. It didn't really matter what. So unlike other librarians, for instance, or parents, she wouldn't sort of put something your way and say, read this. She'd put several things in front of you and say, well, maybe you might want to read this. So it was perfectly all right to read a Mills and Boon or a Barbara Cartland or a Charles Dickens abridged version or something like that. So I think as a 13-year-old, I was reading Albert Camus and then switching rather seamlessly to Mills and Boon, and it was quite all right.
And so you've also said in the past that for you, when you were growing up, English was the literary language, and Urdu was a Gharelu home language. And it's obviously been one of the themes of your career has been your developing relationship with Urdu and with English. So when did you start reading in Urdu?
Okay, so I went to the school which was actually implementing a government formula which many schools choose to forego, the 3-language formula. 6th, 7th, 8th, your schools are supposed to give you a 3rd language as an option. In most schools, Sanskrit is the default option. So 6th, 7th, 8th, a child studies Sanskrit, apart from Hindi and whatever the state language might be. It could be Marathi, it could be Tamil, whatever, and English, of course, if it's an English medium school. But the school I went to in Delhi gave you options, and not just 1 or 2, but large numbers. So you had Italian, German, Punjabi, and I chose Urdu, right? So that was we didn't have a proper Urdu teacher. We had a transport in charge, a certain Mr. Basin, who pronounced alif as alaf. But that didn't matter. He taught me the alphabet, and I think I picked up Urdu there. And then also we had a Maulvi Sahab, who we used to call Molly, who used to come home to teach us the Quran Sharif. Now the alphabet is pretty much similar between Arabic and Urdu. So you had Molly teaching you all of the Arabic, to read the Quran in Arabic. That strengthened my Urdu because, I built on what Mr. Basin was teaching me in school. So it was a happy coming together of different ways of being taught the script. I must also say that in my family, my parents rather organically and instinctively did something very interesting. And parents might might do well to follow this as an experiment. In some homes, like you take off the chappal before you enter the home. In our home, we'd leave English at the door and enter the house. And this was not a laid down rule. It was not like somebody said, switch, or pulled a plug or something. No. Quite instinctively, because our parents were speaking to us in Urdu, Hindustani, let's say, so did we. And it's not as though my parents didn't know English. Of course, they used it for their professional lives. One was a librarian, the other was a doctor. And they were perfectly fluent in English. But however, because this chose to speak to us not just in Urdu, Hindi, Hindustani, but in extremely idiomatic language. So if they had to say, the lady coming in there, for instance, they would say, "Saaf chupte bhi nahi, samne aate bhi nahi." So nobody would say, "Why are you peering through the door?" They'd say that use a verse to make a point. You know, so that was an early influence, that how language can be used, not just in daily conversation, but the flip side was that my language, as you said, my spoken Urdu was and remains a gharelu zaban. I do not have access to a critical idiom. So today when I'm asked, why don't I write in Urdu, I'm afraid I'm not equipped to write in Urdu because I don't have a literary frame. I can read it, but I cannot have easy access to it.
You know, the three-language formula is a custom more honored in the breach than the observance. So it's remarkable that that it actually, in your case, it actually contributed to your career. But so okay, so let's move forward then, because you said you didn't have the critical idiom for Urdu, but then you went on to become actually an academic scholar of Urdu literature, and you went on to do a PhD on the history of the progressive writers movement, which also involved moving again from the discipline of English to the discipline of history or literary history. So, to tell us more about that.
Well, I'd been translating for a very long time. My first published book was in '92. The copyright for Premchand had opened up. And there's a little story behind how I came to be a translator. May I share that? I was working at the India International Center, and I'd gone for a routine meeting with Dr. Rao, who was the editor of the Sahitya Academy's Indian Literatures magazine. And the meeting sort of wrapped up, and then he said, I'm looking for somebody to translate this. The copyright has just opened, and he kind of pulled out a drawer and showed me a story. This was a story called Mandir Masjid by Premchand. And I said, but I haven't really ever translated. But he said, you sound like your English sounds okay, and I'm sure your Hindi must be all right. Do you read? I said, yeah, I do. So he said, why don't you give it a shot and let's see what we can do with it. Just like that, out of the blue. So this unexpected kindness from a virtual stranger just set me on a path that, and I was like somebody who tasted blood, quite literally. I did that one translation, sent it back to him, he published it, and as I said, because the copyright for Premchand had opened up, it was a free-for-all, anybody could translate it. And I think timing is important. '92 is when the big publishing houses were coming to India. HarperCollins had its first opening, the first marriage, as it were, between HarperCollins and Rupa when they started shop in India. They were looking for new titles, so my book happened to be among the first 5 that they published way back then. And '92 was a very exciting time for translations. Suddenly, you didn't have to go running to people and say, listen, publish this. People were interested. Bookshops were making a space. Book review editors were, commissioning reviews of translations. So it was an exciting time because we had very little to show till then. There were, of course, people like Jayaratan who had translated, Bhisham Sahni's Tamas, the first published work of translation by Penguin when it started. And before that, you had the Jatak Katha and the Gita and the other things in translation. You didn't have literary translations, or you didn't have that many literary translations. So '92 is when suddenly the market is opening up. And you don't find it difficult to go to an editor and say, here's a text. The sad thing is, even today, after all these years, very seldom does a book review editor walk up to a translator and say, this is a text which I think. It's still a one-way traffic. As translators, we identify texts, we go to publishers. Of course, it's easier to sort of, as it were, sell the idea. But I do wish Indian publishing, and if there are publishers here, I can't see any, but if there are, it'd be that much nicer for it to be.
Oh, I'll tell you about my brief experience as an editor in a publishing house. Yeah. Every week I'm pitching a project to a translator, and they always reply saying, no, I'd rather do this other book instead. So, I think the thing is, translation is an act. It's something that people do for the love of it, right? So it's very difficult to, the reason why it works in the way you're describing is, I think, partly because, it has to be a passion project for the translator, and that's more likely to be something that she's come up with herself than a commission.
Yeah. Literary translations are a different kettle of fish altogether. One is not translating, for instance, washing machine instructions, or commercial translations are something else altogether. So you're right, literary translations need perforce to be something that you, in the first place, believe in. Otherwise, possibly you won't bring that passion into it. Yeah.
Actually, so then before we go back to the progressive writers movement, let's talk a bit about your career as a translator. So as I said, you've worked in Urdu and Hindi. So apart from, you mentioned Premchand, but other writers, Fanishwar Nath Renu, Intezar Hussain, Krishan Chandar, and that's just prose. I mean, then Kaifi Azmi and other poets as well. And one of the things that I think Rakshanda has achieved in her translation, and I'm saying this as someone who's an English rather than an Urdu reader. So there are two very common wrong tracks that one often sees it, I think, with Urdu to English translation. One is to try to really closely Urdufy English to the extent that the translation reads like a museum piece, right? You're trying to make it map to what you think of as what you imagine to be the ornate style of Urdu in English. The other is to take the opposite approach of something that's very plain and has lost the lyricism and personality. And I think what at least in your prose, what I've really noticed is that you do retain, you are able to be lyrical and you have the confidence to be lyrical while it's still being authentically English. It doesn't read like a kind of garbled, half English.
Thank you, Keshav. But it's a struggle with editors there. I've had editors, the line editors, wanting to flatten out my language, which, as you say, I want to retain as idiosyncratic. I don't think I'm in the business of writing Queen's English. I want to know who's writing Queen's English anymore, and what is Queen's English for that matter. So I think there is a certain Indian quality to the English that we are writing, as long as it's not clumsy, as long as it's not ungrammatical, as long as it's not outright sort of labored. And you're quite right in pointing out that we started as translators, and especially in Urdu, the people before me, the generation before me, they wanted to make it, as it were, what should I say? No nice way really of saying it, but essentially they wanted to translate everything. So they would lumber up a sentence with a whole lot of meanings, or occasionally give meanings in brackets and so on. So you'd say ghee, comma, clarified butter, comma, and then the sentence continues. This just doesn't work, It's a fine line. What you translate, what you retain, what you give in a glossary, and what you think you just want to leave as it is. Those of us who studied English way back in college, our introduction to translators, after all, was through, at least in Delhi University, first year, you did Homer's Odyssey. It is a translated text, after all. It's a Penguin classic, but it's a translated text. So everything was not being made accessible to us. There were certain things we figured out as 18-year-olds straight out of college, but these were translated texts that we were reading. When we read the French symbolists, when we read the Russian masters, we were reading them in translations. And everything, the context was not always apparent to us. We struggled, we found out. So why was our earlier generation of translators wanting to make everything so easy? I felt we needn't do that. The other thing I experiment, increasingly now, and there are two schools of thought. Some reviewers panned it, others thought it was not a bad idea. I like to increasingly now give footnotes. You might well say that a footnote is not really required, it's not a critical text, it's a translation, especially, let's say it's a novel, why do you need a footnote? I feel you do. I feel I don't want to lumber that sentence, which is not my own, which is somebody else's, so I want it to have that context. But I see my role also as a facilitator, so I do want to give that meaning without interfering with what is being said in the body of the text. So increasingly, in the case of, let's say, for example, an Urdu novelist like Intezar Hussain, who relies on a frame of reference occasionally, which may or may not be familiar to a modern day reader, I think possibly that footnote adds value. Of course, some reviewers thought it was a dreadful idea and they panned it.
Yeah, well, I think I can't really understand why they would pan it, because the majority of the works that you translate, I mean, Intezar Hussain is relatively recent, but they are classic texts from some decades in the past, and so those footnotes actually are serving a valuable function for the contemporary reader. So actually, since you mentioned Intezar Hussain, one thing I wanted to ask you was, quite often you're translating, most of the authors you translate have also had other translators, right? And in this particular case of Intezar Hussain, not the short stories but the novel. So the novel you translated, Aage Samandar Hai, is a kind of sequel, or it's part of a sequence. And the previous
part of a trilogy.
And the previous novel, Basti, had been translated by Francis Bridget. So were you conscious of the fact that Intezar Hussain's readership had been used to a certain translator, and that how did that affect your approach to the novel?
Yeah, I was very conscious of it. Frances Bridget is somebody I know very well and admire enormously for the work she does. At the same time, I personally thought that I would not want to take that approach to translations. Basti has been translated by Francis, published in India by OUP. It's considered a world classic, extensively available, extensively cited whenever partition literature is being talked about. Basti is mentioned. But I felt, and I read it, I reviewed it, so I'm quite familiar with that text. I thought personally it was a sterile translation. I thought that it was initially meant for a Western audience, and when it was published in India, maybe it was not changed as, and this is a personal opinion, as it should have been. For instance, Intezar Hussain writes a very rich, flavorsome, idiomatic language, replete with, he's from Western Uttar Pradesh, he lived in Bulandshahr, Meerut area, before he migrated to Pakistan. And he uses a lot of things from Islamic early history, and he uses them almost seamlessly. So the same sentence would have something very typical of Western Uttar Pradesh slang, and then suddenly there would be a reference to some caliph from early Islamic history. I felt that was kind of being flattened out. There are Khalajans and Tayajans and Bade Abbus, and these are different names of relationships. And in Urdu, you have a different name for a father's older brother, father's younger brother, mother's older brother, mother's younger brother, all the rest of it. So I think, why do we need to say uncle so-and-so and aunt so-and-so? When we have all of these, I think we should say Khalajan and then maybe give it in a glossary and people can figure out. So small things like this, I'm not able to sort of elaborate on this, but I personally knew very clearly that I don't wish to do that. I don't wish to flatten it out. I don't wish to use generic names for relationships, for instance.
No, and there's a recent translation of the novel Angan by Kharija Mastoor that I think was a good translation, but the familial names were given in English, and so the father's older brother throughout the novel is called Big Uncle. And I wrote to the translator to say that, why did you do this? And she said, well, for my editor said, for the American readership. It's obviously, it's very helpful for the translator to know who you're translating for. And it does sound like the Indian or subcontinental reader is the first person that you have in mind.
Okay. Keshava, may I just add something in the context of Intezar Hussain's novel? It's a big fat novel. Basti was a slimmer one. The second that I did, Aage Samandar Hai, The Sea Lies Ahead. This was an experiment in translators. I thought I was doing it, then my fellow translator and dear friend Arunava Sinha told me, kind of pulled the plug and told me that others have done it, especially the Latin American novelists have indeed been translated in this fashion. Now, I was reading only as much as I was translating on a given day. I had not finished reading the novel. And the beauty here is a contract had been signed between me and HarperCollins. They didn't know what the novel was about. I frankly didn't know exactly what the novel was about. I had a vague idea, and so no, it was a leap in the dark. Nobody really knew, and so let's say I was able to do 2 paragraphs. So I resisted the temptation to read the 3rd paragraph on that day. I would only read as much as I was planning to translate on that day. And it took almost a year to finish it. I was doing various other things, and so I was not able to work on it at a stretch. And it's a very intense novel to translate, so you can't do it at a gallop. So at the end of the year or so, when I finished that last paragraph, I literally had goosebumps, because that is when I had finished reading this novel, and I was also the first reader Of course, one goes back, one tweaks, one fixes tenses where one has got it wrong the first time round. But the actual act of translation and the actual act of reading was virtually simultaneous.
As far as I know, that's how Constance Garnett worked when she translated some of the Russian novels. I mean, she was translating as she read. But so you having been a translator for many, many years, more recently, about I think a decade ago, less than a decade ago, you published your first book of fiction in English, right? A book of short stories. And it's interesting in the context of yesterday's discussion, because yesterday you spoke about the kind of destruction and reconstitution of the Muslim middle class. And you're one of the few fiction writers in English to take up this subject of the Muslim middle class, right? And also themes like infidelity and divorce. But how did your experience, because, of course, translating fiction is a creative act, right? So how did your experience as a translator then influence your subsequent career as a writer of fiction yourself?
No, actually, I don't see any connection between being a translator and the fiction I wrote. If anything, I'd like to share how and when I wrote the fiction. Sometime about 10 years ago, when I was in my early 40s, I decided I wanted to do a PhD for no good reason, actually, just like that, frankly. And so I enrolled. There's a lock-in period. You don't submit your PhD before 3 years. So the first 2 years, I was the grasshopper who did nothing. The last year, as the remaining year was left, I took a year's leave without pay from the university where I was working. And I rented a little cubicle at the India International Center. Those of you who know the IIC library, the cubicles are these 10 by 10 little spaces, And I would reach there at 10:30 in the morning, and at 8 they would knock at my door and say, "Madam, ab aap jaiye." Now, that is when I'd worked on done the research. It was just a question of sitting down and writing the thesis. So from 10:30 to 8, I would write the thesis. My supervisor was this eminent historian, Professor Moshirul Hassan, world famous for wanting relentless footnoting. So you could not produce a page and show him a draft which did not have relentless and extreme footnoting. So there I was from 10:30 to 8 producing a kind of copy which would meet his requirements. And then I would go home. I had 2 children at that point, a husband, a home to run. I don't know how groceries were bought. I don't know how the family was fed. I have no clue what was going on for those 6 months. I would come home, eat some kind of dinner, kind of vaguely catch up with the day's events, and then I would open my laptop and produce these short stories. It was the craziest time of my life. I was doing 2 very distinct kinds of writing, one that required piles and piles of books, frantic searches through JSTOR, frantic, interlibrary loans and books and all of that. And then I would come home and produce these short stories which required nothing except what was in my head. And how and why those stories came out at that time they did, I don't know, maybe just an adrenaline rush, or I really have no explanation. And I haven't written any fiction since.
Okay, so let's come back to that PhD then. So I was very struck. So of course your work is on the progressive writers movement in Urdu, and I was very struck by something that you said actually in your introduction to your translation of Krishan Chandra's novel Ghadar, Traitor, and let me just find it. You're talking about the progressive writers movement, and you say, yeah, there we go. For most commentators on the literary history of India, the significance of the progressive writers movement is uncontested. Its importance lies not in the intrinsic merits of the writers associated with it or their individual works. It lies instead in the role played by the PWS, the Progressive Writers Association, from the mid-1930s till the mid-1950s, in shaping the political consciousness of large numbers of people, in its unequivocal emphasis on the need for social change, and in the relentless portrayal of these twin forces in the literature produced by the progressive writers. So I was very struck by this. You're saying that it's not the individual works or the literary merits are, the impact is actually more in ideas and politics.
The progressive writers movement has been called by Jaz Ahmed as a hegemonic ideological force. There's some merit in that. Indeed, it was, well, hegemonic is a strong word, but it was a force to reckon with ideologically. It swept large numbers of people, took them in this way. My sense, as one looks back then it seemed everybody was a progressive. And Ralph Russell coming to India, Ralph Russell, the British scholar, translator, academic, comes to India, and he, goes back, and when he's writing his memoir, he says, on my visit, it seemed everybody in India, all the Urdu writers I met, everybody was a progressive. Frankly, everybody was not a progressive. Of course, there was a very strong ideologically driven group, core group, that was indeed very compact in its ideology. But there were a whole bunch of people who were kind of part of the movement, but they were ideologically fluid, right? And then there were also people that we like to call fellow travelers, who kind of went along with the movement. There were others whose output was colored. For the Urdu poet Majaz, who was, even for Faiz, in fact, Ahmad Faiz was writing romantic poetry till he, there are long stories here, I don't know if the context is interesting, but till he was, let's say, enamored, he read Marx, he was enamored by Marxism, and we see a shift in his political outlook. But for Majaz, for example, one of the Urdu poets, it is said, उर्दू में एक कीट्स पैदा हुआ था और प्रोग्रेसिव भेड़िए उसको उठा ले गए. A Keats was born to Urdu and the progressive wolves ran away with him. Now this is putting it a bit crudely, but the fact of the matter is several poets, and the many names here, who had, let's say, romantic leanings, who were writing ghazals in the high tradition of the classical romantic ghazal as we understand it, but they were so enamored by new movement, they wanted to belong, the sense of belonging was important. So it was not just the hegemony, but it was the companionship, the comradeship, the platform it offered, that was attractive. The PWA had very many influential editors who brought out anthologies, who were editors of literary journals. All of this mattered. The people wanted to belong. So your other point was about the literary merit. I think there was occasionally a knee-jerk response to the kind of literature that was being produced. When we see the bulk of literature that comes out, everything is not uniform. One of the diktats from the party really was that, produce things that are relevant. So let's say the naval uprising happens off Bombay, off the coast of Bombay. So the progressives were told to write a story on that. Everything is not able to transcend its time and space and continue to be important. A Ghadar or an occasional story here or there, even though it's located in a very specific time frame, is able to speak to you later, but everything can't.
So I do have many more questions, but I think we have about 10 minutes left. So at this point, we'll open up to questions from the audience. So who wants to go first? Oh, yeah, there are many.
Rakshanda ji, I have a question. I'm Rita Chablani. I'm visiting the Goa festival just for my own fun and pleasure. I'm an author. And I heard you yesterday. Now, my question is that you speak so well, you write so well. What is your preference, writing a novel with your original thought or translation of another author? What is your preference?
I was just telling Keshava a minute ago that I am writing my very first novel, struggling to write it. I haven't written a novel before, so I can't answer your question because I haven't really finished writing one. I can tell you it's a lot of hard work because the challenge here is to find a voice. Nobody wants to hear my voice in an entire novel. I've not been able to locate that voice for the novel, so it's a work in progress.
I wanted to talk about, ask you about translation. You mentioned Homer, the Odyssey, Iliad. There are so many translations. So what is the motivation for, there was a translation of the Odyssey that came out last year, a fantastic one by a woman called Emily Wilson, for example. But so what's the motivation for people to go back and translate something that's already been translated before? What do people think they can bring new to their translation?
A translator's vanity, I suppose. No, but seriously, ideally, I always like to feel that as a translator, you must leave vanity away and realize that this is somebody else's text. So you keep your sense of ego and self and all that for your own work. Having said that, even as a translator, you feel it's not a question of better necessarily, but of doing something differently. I gave the example of Basti. At some point, I'd love to give it a shot, and I know I'd like to do it very differently from Francis. We're not talking about better, good, bad. We're talking of different. So I myself have done Intezar Hussein's short stories. In fact, and as luck would have, and Manto, for example. So many people have done Manto. I have too, and so have many others, and done splendid translations. So I think the challenge is, how would I approach it? And translations too are changing, you know. People are doing it differently. So the same text lends itself to being translated in another way, I think.
When you were talking about Francis Pritchard's translation of Basti and yours,
we haven't translated the same text. We have translated 2 novels that are part of a trilogy.
Right, right,
yeah.
right. Now I was thinking about this, about new translations, retranslating, and you said that you would like to do it. I've translated to Goa, who's been translated by so many people, and what I found was that people are somehow so much in awe of him that the language becomes very flowery, very, you know, and when I look at the original text, to me, I mean, I don't understand why one has to be so much in awe. Something about having to trust yourself and say what you want to bring to it. But do you find that difficult to make that final decision? You know, to say, I don't care what others have said, but I'll trust my own.
Yeah, I think translations, at the end of the day, even if you've read other translations of that particular text or that particular couplet or whatever, Faiz, for example, whom I've translated, or Ghalib, who one does occasionally for an article here or there, has been translated by so many people, and it's out there in the public domain. Most people know it by heart in any case, so they know the meaning. It is a challenge, of course, and one is daunted by it, but I think there is some inbuilt with time. I won't say one is blasé and confident with time, but with time I think you get a sense of, okay, I'm willing to go with this. In Shahryar, a contemporary poet with no baggage, hasn't been extensively translated, but a modern poet, died 4 years ago. I wrote his biography and interspersed the biography with a lot of translations to make points as I was going along. So somewhere it says, Lambi Kali Raat. At the back of my mind was this novel by Agatha Christie called Endless Night. I could have said Long Black Night or Long Dark Night or whatever. I chose to say Endless Night. Now, I have no explanation for why I said it. And I rationalized it and knew that I was falling back on this novel I'd read as a teenager, a detective novel, not even a work of poetry. I chose to say Endless Night because I felt it was justified. He was talking of a Lambi Kali Raat, which he was implying was going on forever. So I thought it was okay to not say Lambi Kali and say endless.
That's such an interesting point, because it's to do with also the literary inheritance of English. I mean, think of the two titles of Proust's novel sequence. So Scott Moncrief went for the Shakespearean Remembrance of Things Past, which has its own resonance in English, versus, and actually, you know, I don't think it's true that the literal translation In Search of Lost Time captures it better, because you are moving it into English, and the English reader has the ear for Shakespeare and all of that. So we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Honey?
We've exhausted it.
No, I don't. That's not. Okay, so the big thing I didn't talk about, because this is it reflects my own interest, is your translations of poetry, right? And this translating poetry in general, but certainly Urdu poetry into English, seems like a impossible feat. So how do you develop the confidence to do it, and how did you go about it?
No confidence at all. I just do it. I'm not a poet. I don't have a ear for poetry. Right now, for instance, I'm translating Gulzar. I have translated Shahryar and in the past Kafi and others. Confidence has nothing really to do with it. You feel you want to do it. You feel there's something here that you found amazing. You want to share with a larger audience, and you find a publisher who's willing to go along. So that is really the impulse. In the case of Gulzar, this is my first experience of working with a living poet, of working alongside somebody who's there. In the past, even Shahryar was gone by the time I got down to doing his translations, and all the others, the Mir and Ghalib and Faiz, have long been gone. So this is a novel experience, one that I'm enjoying thoroughly. Gulzar, as a poet, can knock off just one word from my translation and make it compact, and he's teaching me how to edit poetry, how to edit a translation. I'm finding that useful.
Think about poetry is actually most editors at publishing houses also don't have the expertise or the ear to edit it, let alone to edit a translation of poetry. So it's in a way that this is the best possible form of translation, where you can actually collaborate with the
I've
poet
never worked with a collaborator. I've never worked on a text where the writer's been around. Intizar Hussain was around, but he was like, "Aap jo kar rahi hain, theek hi hoga." So he was not very interested in the process of translation. So this is a novel experience, and one that I'm finding very useful.
Okay, so last question. You mentioned already that writing a novel. So that's the next literary life of Rakhshanda Jalil. But what translation projects are you working on, or is there someone that you haven't translated that you would dream of translating?
हज़ारों ख्वाहिशें ऐसी कि हर ख्वाहिश पे दिल निकले. But one thing that we never got around to talking, and maybe nice way to end here, I started my career, of course, as a teacher, which I left at the university, but I worked for a long time in a publishing company. I've been on both sides of the Great Divide, So the close reading, which actually translation requires, which any form of reading or writing requires, that skill was honed in publishing companies when back then we didn't have fancy designations. We were called either editorial assistant or we were called copy editors, mostly copy editors. Now everybody is a publishing director, everybody is a commissioning editor and so on. I certainly was not a commissioning editor or anything. It's too young and too low in the pecking order. But what that did teach me was to read carefully, to read it carefully, to dot the I's, cross the T's, to watch out for repetition in thought, repetition in saying the same thing again, any flab, basically to pick up flab. And all this comes in handy when you are writing anything, whether you're translating, you're writing an op-ed. Somebody says, give me an op-ed in 600 words. I give exactly 600 words because I'd much rather do that chopping myself and give them 600 words, not 605 words, because somebody will take out the 5 words I do want to keep, right? So these skills come in handy.
So just one quick note that, this point about the title, the job descriptions in publishing. I think it's much cheaper for the publishing house to inflate your title than to inflate your salary. So that's part of the reason. But anyway, so I think Rakhshanda has to go to the airport now. But many of her books are available to be bought. And thank you so much.
Thank you.